Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's 9 o'clock sharp. Let's get cracking. Today's webinar is Payroll Risk and Common Compliance Shortfalls. It'll be hosted by myself, Dave Beattie. I'm a legislative compliance person in the payroll space. I've got 27 years experience in the space, and 6 of that in the beginning of my career was spent at SARS. So I've got a reasonable understanding of how the trade at SARS works, and then I've got obviously significant experience in private practice in terms of how payroll systems work, how different companies work, where the challenges are, and how we can get to a place where we minimize that risk, we cover our bases, and we do so at a reasonable price. It's anyone can employ the best payroll person, the best HR person into their company, but if their company is a small to medium-sized business, it's certainly overkill when it comes to costs. So there are ways of reducing the risk and meeting best practice and having a sophisticated system that does everything that you need. So today we'll go through some of those issues. Okay, sorry, just had a bit of a problem with the slide there. South Africa, as many of you should be aware, we've got some of the best legislation in the world. I think we're coming out of 1994. There was a hunger to grow this country, to make it the country that we know that it can be. And we've seen, certainly in the last 20 years, legislation flooding out there, taking from the best in the world. But does this legislation fit a country like South Africa, where we have such inequality? Haven't we got better priorities? And this webinar will look at that type of thing. Most importantly, you can have all this legislation, but your legislation is only as good as the people who police it. Now, I just want to use an example, the best example that I can think of is probably ETR, Employment Tax Incentive. When that was introduced in 2014, it was literally dumped on us. This legislation that hadn't been tested, that hadn't been run past people like the Payroll Authors Group. And what happened was you had it come in all of a sudden, and it was a disaster. And it's a disaster by the number of changes that have been made to that legislation since 2014. Legislation has to be rolled out after following a very specific process. And that, in the case of tax legislation, involves people in the payroll space. Can this legislation be policed? Can it work in the payroll space? And with ETR, obviously, it was a total disaster. And it's probably one of the most complicated areas of our legislation still. Back to South Africa, though, we have significant competing challenges facing business owners. We're in a really, really tough post-COVID period where a lot of businesses are just looking to survive. Where does legislative compliance fit in their mind? Is legislative compliance something that's not important? Is generating revenue and creating jobs and making money more important? I see that angle, but I also see the angle of legislative compliance because, SARS, our country, is hungry for money. With such a turbulent period where we've had significant corruption, and our rand is depreciated so much. SARS needs money. If you look at our budget every year, the deficit is massive. We can't continue borrowing money at that level. So we have to raise revenue from taxes. And we all know that the tax pools is quite small. So you can guarantee that SARS are going to be looking at companies as their agents of tax collection for such revenue. I remember when I worked in master taxation audit at SARS, we used to only pick on the large companies. Why? Because we could train our staff in those companies because they had all the systems that we would be auditing across the spectrum. And they hated us because they said, you know, we pay so much tax. And after 6 weeks, we would send them an assessment or a suggestion of an assessment, raising millions more. So it was frustrating. And I do sympathize with the South African business owner. But working on the legislation side, I do understand the importance of that legislation. Working in the space, we see firsthand the attitude towards legislative compliance. I think particularly of UIF workman's compensation and basic HR principles. You know, I say SARS has escaped the negative reputation of other government departments, but their crown has slipped significantly in the last 10 to 20 years. And we've seen companies start to take chances. My message to you is SARS are on their way back. SARS are gearing up. SARS are using technology. They're using algorithms. They're using third-party information. So, you know, I wouldn't turn a blind eye to legislation. I would start looking at beefing up to reduce the risk that I have in my organization as soon as possible. So why is there a poor attitude to legislative compliance? In our experience, there are a number of reasons for poor compliance. The main ones are lack of awareness. You know, unfortunately, you know, if you go to SARS and say, well, I didn't know that, it's not really going to be a good excuse in SARS eyes, because ignorance of the law is no excuse. Inadequate skills, very, very important one. We see every day the payroll person is a person who is pulled in many directions. Your small to medium company, the payroll person is a financial or an HR person desperately trying to deal with this payroll. And it's a recipe for disaster because these people are pulled in all different directions, and it's impossible that they can know legislation in all these spaces. You know, even as a legislative compliance person, I learn every day because there's sections of the Income Tax Act that I've never seen. And most recently, I learned about exemptions from income tax for certain bodies that come into South Africa for various functions. And I had to Google that, I had to learn that. But your average payroll person wants to get someone paid. They're relying on third parties, payroll companies, payroll software suppliers to do the right thing for them. And in the payroll company or the payroll software company's defense, they've got software that can do almost anything in the payroll, most things in the payroll space, but they can't run your payroll for you. They can't set up your payroll correctly unless you know what has to be done. So we've got this big hole, and we're gonna investigate that hole a bit later, because that's where most of the non-compliance comes in. Limited training and development options. People ask us all the time, who do we go to for training? There's lots of organizations that have payroll diplomas, etc., but they're too generalized and they're too broad, and they don't prepare the person for the payroll environment. You know, at HR Talk, we prefer to bring in people with no skills and train them up from the ground up, because then we know that we've built the right foundation and we've developed and trained them in all the areas that we know are risky, and that is from years of experience. So you could send your staff on payroll courses, but they're only going to learn little blocks of information. Whether they can put that together and see the big picture is another thing altogether. Cost of compliance considerations. The cost of compliance is huge. I just look at the cost of compliance to HR Talk. You know, I have to be certified every year. I have to attend so many courses every year to get my continued professional development hours up. You know, we continuously sending people on Excel, tax, payroll, software advancement courses, anything to do with software. You know, people are learning, and payroll companies are bringing out new modules all the time, and that's costly to send people on training. And then the unwillingness to comply. You know, having worked at SARS, I've seen this. I've seen the attitude of people to compliance, the attitude, bad attitude towards government in general. And, you know, someone sour with government is going to be sour with SARS. It's not a good thing to do. Well, I say that the reason for non-compliance is important, because what is important to note is that non-compliance is going to be raised sooner rather than later. That is either going to become SARS review, or it's going to become a Department of Labor review. Someone's going to knock on your door, or you can get an email requesting an audit or a meeting date. And that's when the pawpaw hits the fan, because that's when clients who have been obstructive contact us and say, oh, well, we've got this email, and they look at the following things. And guess what? 4 out of the 10 things they haven't done because they've just refused to do it. And we've seen recent mobilization in the following places: employment equity, SARS, the Department of Labor threatening inspections in this space. The domestic employer space, there's still probably hundreds of thousands of domestic employers who are not even registered for UIF purposes, never mind the recently promulgated COID purposes. The declaration files that need to be submitted to SARS. How many people are running this payroll system and are unaware that declaration files have to go electronically to the Department of Labor each month? Without doing that, the Department of Labor doesn't have a history of your employees. So if they go on maternity leave, or they're retrenched, or they're sick, there's no way of that person easily getting access to benefits, because there's no history. Rejected UIF claims due to non-compliance. Exactly what I've just said. We are having fits in this place at the moment, because you filing is a disaster. Compliance in the UIF space is a disaster. The declaration files, you know, you as a company, we often have proof of submission. Employees are still going there, and there's information missing for some reason. So the Payroll Authors Group are begging the Department of Labor to please come to the table to work in this space, so that we can get some sort of solution and have it developed soon. And then we've also seen the Department of Labor aggressively following on outstanding UIF liabilities. Why? Because with TERS, a lot of money was paid out. The coffers are bare, so now they want their money. A good example is the COVID-19 pandemic. You know, it happened, and it was probably one of the most traumatic experiences in our history. And compliance was brought up quite quickly, because companies had to send their employees home, and companies were not trading and not generating revenue. So how would they pay their employees? Well, the good old term TERS came, and TERS would not be paid out unless you jump through certain hoops. And unfortunately, with the poor systems and with the majority of employers not compliant, jumping through those hoops became very, very difficult. Okay. And it showed us quite quickly that employers have almost no understanding of the UIF process. Yes, they've got a UIF number. And my first question would be, have you got two UIF numbers? And they say, no, we pay SARS. Paying SARS, the UIF, is just one step of the process. SARS are the collection agents. You then have to have an 8-digit UIF number, which is a separate application. And you have to tell the Department of Labor of your SARS number so that money that SARS collect can be transferred to your UIF number, and so that you can be compliant. What happens? Some companies do not have a SARS UIF number. So SARS are transferring money that's going into a suspense account. It's a total disaster. The second non-compliance issue, as I mentioned, was the monthly declaration files. It's shocking how many companies are unaware of that. And then, who are the victims of non-compliance? It's the employees. This last week, we've spent a lot of time trying to assist clients whose employees were going on maternity leave and they were being chased away from the Department of Labor. So we've seen an attitude adjustment at the Department of Labor as well. And the system is broken, and we actually feel pity towards these people who are making applications. But there's only so much we can do. We can only follow the process, and that process is to submit these declaration files. The Department of Labor have a problem that side. It's going to lead to frustrated employees at a time that they least could afford it. Okay, so what was clear is that employers do not place much importance on compliance in the UIF space until there's a problem, obviously, and then it becomes people like our problem, and then they become very aggressive because they've got aggressive employees. And we've done a multitude. I've probably done more than 150 UIF registrations already this year for companies of significant size who have been non-compliant, and having to explain this process to them. And obviously they get belligerent because they don't want to have to pay for that. And they see it as more legislation. Also concerning is how many employers do not know the criteria for deducting UIF from someone. You know, if someone works for you for more than 24 hours, you have to deduct UIF. So those of you who use casuals and are bringing casuals literally from the streets on a daily basis, if that person is working for more than 24 hours a month, you have to have them on the payroll. Now, people resist that because it's costly to add them to the payroll. But if you don't add them to the payroll, they're not going to be paying UIF. And even worse, they're not going to be covered for workman's compensation. Going back a step, most employers don't even know who is an employee for UIF purposes. So we've got a big hole there. So unless your payroll person is very smart, or you are outsourcing your payroll to someone very smart, this is going to be another hole to you. So as I said in my final point there, a lot of these issues have gone unnoticed until we have a crisis like TERS. Now, obviously, employers had never expected to have such a thing as a COVID shutdown or the issuing of TERS, but that is just a small example of what can happen if you are non-compliant. Moving on to workman's compensation, or otherwise known as COID. How important is this in the workplace? This is probably dealt with even worse than UIF. The number of companies that are not COID registered is alarming. And the critical thing to note is if you're not registered for COID and you have an issue with an employee, whether that person dies injured or sick as a result of working in the workplace, you are going to have significant personal liability as a company and company directors. You will be subject to a civil claim for any, obviously, medical expenses and loss of income. Take a scenario of someone who loses limbs and cannot work for the rest of their life. That could be 10, 15, 20 million, could be 50 million. I've actually got a couple of cases where trusts have been formed for people who cannot work anymore, and we were talking more than 25 million. So as an employer, you have an obligation to register for COID. When you register for COID, whatever happens in the workplace is reported to COID, and then COID take over responsibility for payments. In practice, the first 3 months, the employer would pay the employee's salary, but that would be refunded by COID. And that employee would go to a private hospital, and the paperwork would be done by the hospital with COID. You as an employer have only got an obligation to lodge the incident. So very, very important that you reduce the risk that you're faced with by registering for COID and paying once a year for this this effective insurance premium, so that you are compliant. Obviously, if you are not following safety procedures and a person is injured, you would have the Department of Labour on your back, but that is a separate issue. That is not a COID issue. So when in doubt, put people on your payroll for COID purposes. While companies often assume that their payroll is compliant, they're often mistaken, because they tell me things like, oh, I'm with Sage, or I'm with Saba, or I've been with Pastel for VIP or whatever for years, and I'm compliant. They unfortunately very mistaken. The payroll function is severely neglected because it's not a money-making function in the company. As I mentioned earlier, it's really frustrating to see the poor person or the level of person that is dumped into the payroll space. You know, even on the payroll the payrolls we deal with on an outsourcing basis, you know, information has to come in, intelligent information. And if you're putting a clerk with no experience in that space, or you're managing your payroll by a clerk who's pushing a button and praying things work, you are literally on a hiding to nothing, and you are going to have compliance issues. The absence of a specialist payroll becomes a huge risk area, and even our big clients that have internal payroll people, their reason for involving an outsourced company is the area of risk. They do not want to be exposed to risk, because it's very hard to quantify risk in the payroll space. So whilst a payroll system will have significant valuable information and be able to do everything, if it's not set up, you know, if there's not the experience of payroll involved in this process, there's not continuous training and good communication, you're going to have a challenge. Even, as I said, with outsourcing, you know, we deal with clients that send information that actually is scary. Pay someone X allowance without any explanation as to what that allowance is. Is that allowance taxable, non-taxable? Is it reportable to SARS on assessment? Is it not? Is it for the right purpose? You know, I think of a transport assistance allowance. In payrolls, that is often taxed as a travel allowance. It's not. A transport assistance allowance is a fully taxable allowance that will enable someone to get to work. So a critical error, which if paid to the wrong employee who's not, who's submitting a tax return and they do not know that they have to keep a logbook, or in this case, they don't keep a logbook because they don't do any business travel. It becomes a huge challenge, because SARS are going to deny them any travel claim, and they're going to have to pay the tax on that allowance on assessment. So it's a huge problem. Misunderstandings between HR and payroll are commonplaces, and this leads to coding errors, tax challenges, as I mentioned. The right questions need to be asked. I call it interrogating the input. I tell all of my payroll people, they must interrogate that input. They must ask the right questions. Stating that we must add a travel allowance to a payroll. Questions such as, is the person required to travel for business purposes? Has this been updated in their employment or their contract of employment? Are they aware that they have to keep a logbook? All those questions can save the employer and that employee significant strife. Reliance on payroll support consultants is a huge challenge. Now, I'm not saying that they're not good. They're all very good, or generally very good. The challenge is that payroll support consultant from Sage or Cyber is only going to do what you ask them to do. Unless they are very experienced and are going to interrogate the instruction, there's a good chance that this is going to be set up incorrectly in payroll. And in my career, I've seen a lot of payroll administrators who don't know their payroll software well enough and who call in consultants to add codes every single time they change anything. And what that does is that fills me with fear because I'm not sure that that is set up correctly. And when I speak to payroll support consultants, they will often tell me that the payroll is set up using a common deck approach. So it's not necessarily set up according to the client's needs, because that would be significantly more costly. They don't sit and work through the payroll and ask all the questions relating to the setup of payroll. So we have challenges, and we're going to go through those challenges a bit later. So I say that the nature, the function, and the expectations of the transaction must be clear to all parties to this transaction. So how do you reduce this risk? And the only way that I can see this is to do a review of the payroll, and to do a review either at a certain point in time. People often do reviews when they do a payroll conversion to different software types. And often that's where the mistakes are found. So the risk review will identify possible non-compliance and also give an indication of the competence of the administrator, the accuracy of the payroll setup, and then obviously identify areas where there can be improvements before there's a SARS audit. It's always best to do those audits as soon as possible, and then literally hope that a year or two goes by so that when SARS come, you've got a nice clean payroll and all the dirty laundry has disappeared. Okay, so moving on, I've listed here some areas, particularly non-compliance areas, that we've identified when doing these risk reviews. I'm going to go through them quite quickly, but I'll briefly describe where the error occurs. Okay, so firstly, the lack of understanding in terms of the application of the various SARS fringe benefit and deduction codes. Shocking to know how many payroll administrators don't actually know the difference between subsistence, taxable, non-taxable, and foreign subsistence. I deal with those literally on a weekly basis. The incorrect tax treatment of risk premiums. Most employers who contribute to a retirement fund contribute towards group life, death, disability, and funeral. They contribute not knowing that those risk contributions could be unapproved risk. And if they're unapproved risk, those are fringe benefits that are taxable. So although it's a small issue, if SARS come and look at your payroll, a big payroll over 5 years, that could add up to 100, 200,000 in non-compliance. So a good area to look at. The inclusion of subsistence allowances and fixed cost to companies. It's strictly forbidden by the legislation. Subsistence is paid in addition to your package, and it's paid in the month that you're required to travel. So you can't factor in a tax-free subsistence allowance. Incorrect implementation of travel allowances and no coverage of this in the letter of appointment. often see companies who give everyone above a certain grade a travel allowance. SARS are going to come in and just disallow 3/4 of those allowances and recover any tax shortfall from the employer. Never mind going and rustling in individual employees' tax returns. Travel allowance are only given to those people who travel significantly for business purposes. And you must put that in writing and put it in their letter of appointment, contract of employment, even if it's as an addendum. Incorrect tax treatment of travel reimbursements. No IP5 reporting. A lot of employers think that because it's a tax-free reimbursement, it doesn't have to be on payroll. It does. There's a specific code for that. So it needs to be clear what rate per kilometer, and that rate per kilometer sets off a chain of events in payroll in terms of reporting of that transaction. Basic conditions of employment earnings not understood or set up in payroll. If you don't set up your payroll in the beginning correctly, how would you know what the employee's basic conditions of employment earnings are? Because that figure is going to dictate whether the person is entitled to overtime. Leave pay. Often we see employers paying leave pay based on basic pay. No, it's not. Leave pay is based on their cost to company remuneration. There's very specific income codes that get added together to calculate leave pay. If that's not set up correctly, the payroll system's not going to calculate it correctly. The same applies to COID. The COID definition of remuneration is out there for you to see. It's on your COID return of earnings. You need to ensure that all those variables are adding up on your COID report for COID reporting when you do your return of earnings. If not, you're going to have an audit at some stage and it's going to be wrong. Casuals and part-time employees. Frustrating to see how few of these people get added onto the payroll, particularly when it comes to UIF and COID purposes. You know, as I've mentioned earlier, that guy at the gate, you know, you might see him as a casual, you might see him as a nothing, but that person is a South African resident entitled to UIF if he works more than 24 hours a month and is entitled to benefits. That person might be working for 10, 15 different companies a month. There might be significant earnings there that this person can claim benefits against. So you need to know who to include. Never mind the rules around casuals and the 25% deduction. Very few employers understand that legislation. Calculation of severance pay in the tax directive applications. Severance pay is another thing. You're going to get into significant trouble if your severance pay calculation is incorrect. You're dealing with frustrated, emotional employees who are leaving the organization. It needs to be right, and you need to apply for a tax directive to give them their tax exemption based on the 500,000 lifetime exemption. You need to get that right, otherwise you're going to be in the CCMA. Never mind those people who have CCMA settlements that they're not taxing correctly. You're going to be in SARS bad books. Company cars versus pool cars. I've been dealing with that my whole career. If done correctly, it can save you a bit of money, but most people just insist on ignoring the fringe benefit implications of a company car. And then on audit, it becomes extremely costly. Reimbursements versus allowances versus advances, very different things. I urge you to look at interpretation note 14. Reimbursements must have a very specific process. Allowances must be reported in the employee's letter of appointment. And advances are an amount that is advanced in the month, payable back by the employee in that month. Otherwise, it's a loan. So be careful in that space. Lack of reimbursement controls, that's linked to the one above. Nothing will annoy SARS more than you paying an employee without suitable audit trail of invoices and authorizations. Long service awards, very badly dealt with by employers out there. There's some new legislation in this space, so get some specialist assistance in this space if you do have long service award processes. Bursaries and the exemptions applicable to bursaries, legislation has been out there a long time. People are still dealing with it badly, and also not putting the company's expectations in writing. So, yeah, there's been some challenging cases in that space. Accommodation fringe benefits and the treatment of expats coming into South Africa. There's some exemptions that most employers don't know about. Acquisition of company assets by employees, and particularly cars and laptops, very, very common. There's a process that has to be followed in terms of getting a valuation on those vehicles or laptops, and either charging the employee that amount or taxing that as a fringe benefit. Independent contractors, personal service companies. Yeah, almost my whole career, this has been a massive risk to the employer. I deal with at least 5 of these a month, where I assist companies evaluate the individual that they're dealing with to ascertain whether they're an independent contractor or an employee. Folks, this is probably the most risky of all of these issues, in that if you get this wrong, SARS are going to come in and tax what you've paid, what you think is the independent contractor. If they deem that person to be an employee, they're going to recover the tax from you as the employer. And if the person's on a high salary, that's going to be a lot of money, not to mention a late payment penalty and secondary penalties and interest. So you need to get that right. You need to have a process, and you need to get specialist help in terms of working through that process. Medical aid tax credits and secondary tax credits. What is the company's policy? Often, I'm dealing with cases where the company's providing medical tax credits to people that they don't pay the medical aid for. You as an employer have to get proof of the employee making contributions before the medical aid tax credit can be provided. And I would suggest that you only provide a medical tax credit to an employee if you are physically making the payment to the medical aid, and that there are X number of people on the policy. Employment tax incentive, wonderful opportunity if you're employing people in the applicable age group. Can save the company a fortune. Why is this introduced? Governments believe it's cheaper to give your employer the ETR deduction than to provide training in various fields to those employees themselves. So there are companies out there that have made significant progress in this space in terms of massive ETR deductions, never mind income tax allowance deductions, by running an effective employees tax incentive scheme. However, there's just as many companies who have cut corners and have ducked and dived in this space and are illegally claiming ETR deductions. So be very careful with ETR. And then private retirement annuity contributions. Look, I wouldn't give an employee an RA deduction in the payroll unless they provided me annually with proof of contributions. Okay, now I'm going to move over just to some of the HR areas that I pick up. When I do my risk reviews, I generally look at payroll and HR links. Now, please bear in mind, I'm not an HR person, but a lot of these areas are quite closely associated. Okay, the first place is contracts of employment are outdated or legislatively non-compliant. And the reason I say this is because often the contracts of employment are 20 years old and do not actually list all the facts. So employees being given company cars or laptops or travel allowances hasn't been updated. There's not even an addendum. So I think it would be good policy every couple of years to look at your contracts of employment for legislative compliance, because legislation does change, and you want to be that employer that hands a really good quality contract to SARS or the Department of Labour when they visit. Because in my experience, if I went to a company and they had systems in place that were best practice, world class, I know that I'm not going to be there the full 6 weeks. I'm only going to be there 2 or 3 weeks. So you want the SARS people out as soon as possible. There's no policies or procedures. What is the risk there? If the company hasn't put its terms and conditions down on paper, it's very hard to discipline employees for strain. So, for example, private use of the Wi-Fi network, downloading movies during work time, all those things. If standards in people are different. If you don't put them in writing, if you don't put down your stance towards drink and drugs in the workplace, sexual harassment, all these things are critically important to have a company that meets industry best practice. Lack of knowledge regarding leave rules and leave pay, big holes there. Lack of knowledge regarding severance pays and directives, we covered that earlier. Your HR department need to know the rules, because generally they are giving information down to payroll people. And you can't expect payroll people to understand HR legislation as well. I get told that every day. There's also poor understanding around the rules of employing foreigners and asylum seekers. People seem to be quite blasé about non-compliance in this space, but you do not want to be caught out by immigration and home affairs. Who are employees in terms of the various acts? Now, I put that in there because it's quite important to know, but quite frankly, the playing field changes all the time in this space. And, through the Payroll Authors Group, we've put significant pressure on the various organizations to try and come up with a common definition of employee, a common definition of remuneration, so that this commonality can run through the various functions. Do employees understand that you can be an employee for COID, but not for UIF and PAYE? Now we're getting a bit technical, but these are all areas that are important decisions. Inadequate induction procedures. Without an adequate induction procedure, you're setting yourself up to fail, because you haven't set out the ground rules. You haven't shown the employee where the line is, where the line in the sand is, in terms of where they're going to be disciplined if they step over. It's just really important. It's like disciplining a child. You're setting that groundwork towards developing them into a decent, well-functioning human being. Poor understanding of legislation around fixed-term contractors and independent contractors. Huge challenges in the space. You could be dragged to the CCMA if you get rid of a fixed-term contractor that's had their contracts rolled too many times. You also need to know that long-term fixed-term contractors are required, are entitled to severance pay at the termination of the contract. So issues that you need to talk to a professional about. No basic performance appraisal process. Now, I know that not many companies like to work in the space, nor in the job grading space, but it's critical that you have some sort of a process, particularly if you're going to be telling employees that you're going to be paying them based on performance. You can't willy-nilly pay someone different amounts if there hasn't been a performance appraisal. At the same time, it's important, in terms of non-performance. How do you prove a person is not performing if you haven't done an appraisal of their performance? particularly in the when they're doing a probation. You know, you need to be doing this monthly, and you need to be showing them where their weaknesses are and helping them develop. Otherwise, you're going to get dragged to the CCMA. Lots of companies are still not doing basic clearance checks on incoming employees, criminal checks, education, payroll checks, credit checks. In the payroll and HR space, I would think it'd be extremely important to ensure that you don't have a criminal, you don't have someone who's previously been convicted of fraud. You've got someone who's got the education that they say they have. You know, you're employing someone in a payroll space who says that they've got various diplomas and degrees. Meanwhile, they don't. And also from a credit check perspective, someone who's got a bad credit history, you do not want them near your money. You do not want them near your employees' money either. So these checks are relatively reasonable. You need to have them done, and we can certainly assist you in this space. No progress has been made in the POPI space. POPI legislation is here, and it's being applied. You know, before you have a crisis, sort your POPI policy out. Make sure people are trained in your organization. They know where the boundaries are. And then finally, there's no internal processes for receiving or dealing information about improprieties in terms of the Protected Disclosures Act. So basically, whistleblowing. You should have a system, fail-proof system of whistleblowing, so that people are comfortable to tell you if there's any fraud or theft going on in the organization. And as I've said, these are just some of the more common ones. I mean, I could probably go on all day, but that's not the point of this webinar. The point of this webinar is to identify the risks and where you should be looking, and what you should be doing to ensure that you do not fall into these holes. I've said it's a surprise to note the lack of resources and attention that gets paid to human resources in general. People see it as a warm and fuzzy function, something that, you know, someone can do with a hug, you know. It doesn't work like that. That might be part of the process, but you need someone with skills and experience, someone who can help in the following areas: employee development and training, employee well-being, employee benefits, creating an environment that is conducive to happy and productive employees, low staff turnover, someone who's got an idea about remuneration structures, someone who can deal with challenging issues such as complaints, whistleblowing, and critically, someone who can promote HR policies in a fair and equitable way. On a daily basis, we see the cost of non-compliance. Those companies that get dragged to the CCMA all the time, those companies that are wasting massive amounts of money with employee incapacity, employees that are continuously on sick leave, where there's just a lack of control in basic areas. This leads to senior management tied up in disciplinary inquiries. And if I got 10 Rand for every time I heard a senior manager say, I spend more time in the CCMA than I do at work, I would be a rich man. And that is, that is sad to see, because it shows that you're doing a lot of things wrong in your organization. You need those skilled senior people to be focusing their energy on important issues. New business owners, I go see new business owners and they say to me things like, I spend 60% of my time on babysitting people and I have very little time to generate new products and make sales. You're basically answering your own question then. You need to change. You need to look at the cost of your wasted time and look at the cost of getting specialist help. And you need to do that as soon as possible. And then what I've done is I've just listed a process that we go through. We have a risk review process. I've said 1.5 hours, but it's generally less than that. It's a very casual process, and what I like to do is I like to have the role players in the meeting or on the Teams meeting just so that we have the right answers. And I go through some questions, and those questions result in, just a bullet point feedback on areas where they're non-compliant. Obviously, I can't help them meet compliance for free, but we do have this free HR review, and I'm offering it to anyone who would want to do it, HR payroll review, just to see where you are non-compliant. And then you're welcome, obviously, to come to us or whoever you like to ensure compliance. But obviously, we would prefer you to come to us because we know your payroll, and we know who you are. I just believe that knowing where the holes are in your organization and being able to start a process, even if you can't do it all at once, start a process towards moving towards compliance is better than sitting on your hands, burying your head in the sand and hoping that this goes away. Because when the pawpaw hits the fan, it's impossible to tell what the cost of that non-compliance is going to be. So I urge you to please consider this, or at least start looking at the issues that I've identified. If you worry that your payroll is not set up properly and you want to drag your payroll support people in, please do it, because if that's the only thing you got out of this webinar, then we've won. I've definitely won in that. You are going to be compliant when leave's paid out or overtime is calculated, and you're saving money in the long run in terms of non-compliance fees. So folks, please have a look at those issues, go through those bullet points, and you're welcome to contact me at any time, and I'll certainly will assist you the best I can. We are going to send out the slides, so you'll be provided with my details with those slides. I just want to have a quick look at the questions that have come in. Yes, the slides will be shared, and we've got people already saying that they need payroll training. Please contact me, and I need to know more specifics in terms of where you want to go, what you want to do, what software you use would obviously help. And then MZ, he says, it's so true that ignorance is not a defense. However, for SMMEs, they may not have reached stability from a revenue generation point of view and have a healthy cash flow. How does one reduce payroll risk efficiently with a small or no budget at all? 100%, that's exactly what I've been preaching all along. MZ, what I would suggest you do is you identify your areas and you start working on them within your budget. So, there's a lot of companies out there that are very reasonable, and I would say HR Talk is included in that. We aim at the small to medium company in terms of the provision of these types of services, and we understand your position, and obviously we would put together a solution that is within your budget. We know what the important areas are, and we know where you need to focus. So for a small to medium business, let's just, as an example, putting in place a contract of employment and a policy and procedure manual might be the most critical thing until it is slightly bigger, more employees, and have a budget for HR issues. From a tax perspective, just a brief review of your payroll and asking the right questions is a good start, and that need not be expensive. Charles, where we can get more info on the checklist, basically, I'll provide my details, and then you're welcome to email me, and then I will set up the process with you. And typically we would have a Teams meeting. I will just have a general conversation, and as I said, it is non-threatening. I'm not SARS. I'm going to help you identify and move to a place where you're going to be more confident of having SARS visit you. Some of those reviews take 20 minutes, some take an hour, depending on how many issues you've got. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to point you in the right direction. How you choose to resolve those issues is up to you. But I think once you know the challenges, you'll feel a little bit more comfortable than, rather than having SARS or Labour come in and find all these things that you didn't know about. Okay, folks, that's it. We're out of time, and thank you so much for your time. I went on a bit longer than I thought, but important area. And if you've learned anything today, obviously I'm chuffed. This is going to go onto YouTube, and as I said, you will get the slides. Thank you, and please continue to support HR Talk on our Wednesday webinars. Have a lovely day.